Here, with me. Sorry.
And what did your foot look like?
Backwards. I've never met him before in my life.
Philip soon learned his kidnapper, 17-year-old Joseph Clark, had an odd obsession.
He pushed me back on my back onto a bed, and he grabbed my ankle and he twisted it and broke it. I asked him why. He said he was fascinated with the sound of breaking bones.
Hey! So today I have for you a true crime case, and I'll also be doing my makeup at the same time. And just a bit of advice, make yourselves comfortable because today's video is gonna be a really long one. So today's case takes us to the summer of 1995 when a teenager called Ted was abducted from his Wisconsin home by another teenager known as Joe. Ted would go on to suffer 2 days of torture at the hands of Joe, who became known as the Bonebreaker Killer, before Ted escaped barely alive. And thank you for this request, Samantha. Now, a police investigation would later reveal that Joe had murdered at least one other teenager and he had plans to kill many more. And he was so close to carrying his evil plan out, but thanks to Ted's will to survive, he couldn't. And that's how we got to today's story or today's case. Let's start with the word in Romanian for today, which is spărgător de oase. Spărgător de oase. Spărgător de oase. Well done, guys. You just said Bonebreaker. Okay, so on the evening of July 29th, 1995, 13-year-old Thaddeus Phillips, nicknamed Ted, was sleeping on the sofa with his 5-year-old sister in their new home in Baraboo, Wisconsin. When someone picked Ted up from the couch, he just assumed that, it was his father carrying him to bed, which would happen quite often. Ted or his siblings would be tired and they would just fall asleep on the couch, like kids are, and their dad or their mom would usually carry them to bed. So, Ted at that point didn't really think much of it. Earlier in the day, Ted and his family all went out for dinner. His mom, his dad, and his 3 younger siblings. After dinner, they returned home, they spent some time together, and eventually his parents went to bed. Ted and his younger sister were still in the living room watching TV on the couch. After some time, they dozed off. They both fell asleep on the couch. Still half asleep, but starting to wake up, Ted got quite confused when he realized that he was actually being carried outside. He could feel the cold, but in his half-asleep state, he actually believed that whoever was carrying him outside, it must have been one of his dad's friends, who maybe had some, car problems or something else and needed his help. Being only 13 years old, in Ted's mind, it kind of made sense that his dad's friend couldn't wake him up, so wanted Ted's help instead. But Ted was actually being carried outside by an unfamiliar older teenage boy. This boy didn't seem weird or threatening, and he was quite friendly. It was still dark outside and Ted didn't exactly realize what was going on. He was still half asleep. Ted and his family had only just moved into their new house just a couple of weeks back, and when Ted asked this person carrying him where his car was, the person said that it was just over the hill that they were walking towards. When this person asked if Ted could help him with his car, still dazed and sleepy, Ted agreed. This stranger then asked Ted if he could run with him, so they just started running, which was kind of weird, but maybe, this stranger, he just wanted to get out of the area as soon as possible. And again, Ted was just 13 years old and he believed at that point that he was helping one of his dad's friends. After running for a while, they finally arrived at this teenage boy's house, which was around half a mile away from Ted's house. This house looked really badly run down and it wasn't really looked after, And there was trash just about everywhere. There was old food scattered throughout. There were dirty dishes everywhere. And very quickly, Ted realized that this wasn't a friend of the family, but Ted didn't panic. He wasn't scared and he didn't quite feel that there is any reason for him to be scared. The stranger told Ted that he lived there with his brother as they went into the house. Once there, the boy said that his name was Joe and he would soon throw a party. He said there will be other people joining the party soon, and when mentioning a couple of names, Ted knew these boys either from the neighborhood or from his school, so he didn't really think much of it. In the meantime, Joe asked if Ted liked model cars, saying that he has trucks and cars upstairs if he wanted to check them out. These were in Joe's bedroom, to which Ted agreed, not knowing the terror that would soon be unfolding. In the meantime, at Ted's home, it was around 4 a.m. when his dad, Donald Phillips, had woken up and he went to the living room to check that the kids went to sleep in their own beds. That's when he saw that his 5-year-old daughter was still asleep on the couch, but she was all alone. This was unusual because Ted would never leave her alone, asleep on the couch. He would have taken her upstairs. So Donald, he has no idea what the hell is going on at this point. He starts looking around and he notices that Ted's shoes, his sneakers, were in the exact same place where he had left them in the evening, which was confusing to Donald. That meant that Ted, wherever he went barefoot, which again didn't make sense to Donald because Ted just didn't do that. So the Phillips family, they had, like I said, only recently moved into the area. So neither Donald nor his wife felt comfortable going around the neighbors asking for help because they didn't exactly know them. Okay, before we move any further, I just want to give you a quick disclaimer. I mean, I was really struggling when I did my research on this case, so I just want to give a quick disclaimer that some of the dates might not be accurate, in particular the years, because I found conflicting informations from various sources and articles. So again, I do apologize if I'm getting any of the dates wrong, especially the years. Okay, so moving back to the case. So we know that Ted's parents, they became really concerned, but they didn't really want to ask the neighbors for help because they barely knew the neighbors. But they both started to grow really concerned. They just couldn't find Ted anywhere. They spent the whole morning searching for him in all of the places that they thought he would go. The Baraboo swimming pool, the Columbia County Fair, even the camping spot at the Baraboo River. They essentially spent the whole day searching for Ted, but he was nowhere to be found. So Donald Phillips decided to call the Baraboo police to report Ted missing. Donald would later say that he could have saved Ted from so much torture only if he would have knocked on Joe's door, because Donald went to some neighbors searching for Ted, but he didn't go to Joe's house. He never thought that Ted would go there. So back to Joe's house. Once Ted was upstairs in Joe's house, Joe would show his true colors. Unknown to Ted, Joe took immense pleasure in breaking bones. In particular, in hearing bones breaking and then fixing them so that he could break them again. So now I guess you kind of get why he was nicknamed the Bonebreaker Killer. Joe, who was 17 years old at the time, grabbed Ted and threw him on a dirty bed, then jumped on him and grabbed him by the ankle. He then began twisting Ted's foot around his leg until the bone above his ankle snapped and splintered. Immediately after this attack, Joe sat on the bed next to Ted and buried his face in his hands, as if at this point Joe was kind of feeling guilty about what he just did, but Ted was already by this point in survival mode. Although in shock and confused by what was happening, he tried to escape. The adrenaline just kicked in and he ran out of the room and down the stairs. As he was running, he could feel the broken bones of his ankle slide further up his leg, rubbing against the other bone in his leg. Ted, however, made it through the living room and halfway through the kitchen before, sadly, Joe caught up to him. The torture inflicted on Ted was severe, continuing for hours at a time. It seems that Joe would torture Ted just to get out his frustrations. For example, Joe's car wouldn't start, so he twisted Ted's legs until they splintered, then he broke his knees and even jumped on his chest. When Ted tried to fight back or to escape, the torture became even more brutal. Joe pushed a pillow over Ted's face to suffocate him. This abuse would take place for approximately 43 hours. After the initial attack, which broke Ted's leg near the ankle after catching up to him, Joe wrapped his arm around Ted's neck, putting him in a chokehold, and then dragged him back to the living room and threw Ted on the couch. But Ted wouldn't give up so easily. He was trying to figure out how he could escape. He started talking with Joe, trying to kind of be his friend, saying that he wouldn't tell anyone what happened, and he would just say that he tripped over a table and that's how he got injured. But Joe said that no one would believe this story. As the night turned into morning, Ted asked Joe if he could call his parents, just to let them know that he was okay. To his surprise, Joe agreed. So Joe handed him a phone, and Ted, he tried calling, only to realize that the phone was actually disconnected. It wasn't just physical torture inflicted by Joe, but also mental torture. Joe just laughed and he just enjoyed watching the hope drain from Ted's face and his eyes. Ted even tried to reason with Joe, asking him why he would do this. But what Joe said was completely shocking. He told Ted that he enjoyed the sound and the feeling of bones breaking when he would make this happen. He even said that he did something like this before, and he described how much he loved doing it. Ted also asked him why didn't he do it to himself, and Joe said that he tried to do it actually, but he could never get the angle right to break his own bones, which, guys, this is just completely insane. It's insane. After Joe threw Ted on the couch, Joe grabbed Ted's right leg and began to force it up towards his head. He put all of his weight on it, and Ted's leg was over his head when his femur snapped. Now, just to give you an idea of the force needed to do this, the femur is considered to be the strongest bone in the human body, the largest and the thickest bone, protected by layers of muscle surrounding it. It takes around 4,000 newtons of force to break the femur, which is around 900 pounds of force. The majority of femur breaks seen by physicians are from traumatic accidents such as car accidents. Hopefully now you can better understand the force needed, but it wasn't just the bone breaks either. Joe would also punch and kick Ted. They were just constant blows. Ted would later say that he didn't feel any pain from it, it was just a loud pop. But right after breaking his leg, something happened. It was as if a switch flipped, and Joe suddenly behaved just like a normal person, as if nothing even happened. So after a few hours of watching TV, Joe carried Ted back upstairs to the bed. Ted was fighting back the whole time, hitting Joe in the back of the head and trying to punch him. This only made Joe angrier, so Joe got on top of Ted with his back towards his face. He grabbed Ted's left ankle and he began to twist and twist and twist and again until the ankle snapped and splintered. Ted described it like twisting a rubber band. Joe told Ted not to scream or to fight back, otherwise he will break his neck or his back. Joe would also hold a pillow over Ted's face, or he would force Ted to hold the pillow himself. Ted fully believed that Joe was capable of breaking his neck or his back. He already broke his leg and both of his ankles, so Ted, at this point, he had no reason not to believe him. Throughout all of this, Ted refused to cry. He wouldn't let Joe know how scared he was. Throughout the day, Joe would leave the house and he would go outside to try and get his car started. After each time, Joe would go back into the house, up the stairs, complaining about the car, taking his frustrations out on Ted by inflicting even more pain and more damage. After each torture session, Joe would pretend to administer aid to Ted. He had loads of white socks that he would put on Ted's feet, trying to make casts. After getting the socks on, it was like the switch would flip again, and Joe would just behave normally again. Joe also put leg braces on Ted and forced him to walk around. He forced Ted to walk to where the stairs were and stand at the top of them. Ted would describe this as standing on a board at the top, and either the board gave way or Joe kicked it out, sending Ted tumbling down, landing on his back. At this point, Ted's injuries were just getting worse and worse. His ankles were swollen the size of softballs, and his right thigh was swollen to the size of a basketball. His legs were black and blue. Joe dragged Ted back upstairs and left him on the bed. During Ted's 43 hours of captivity, he tried at least 2 times to escape Joe's house. The first time he tried was right after Joe broke his ankle. As the night was setting in, Joe left Ted alone in the house. Ted heard the front door close and then a car driving away. This would be the time for Ted to escape. He knew that he had to do everything he could to just get out. At that point, Ted was more in shock than he was in pain. So, Ted forced himself off the bed and dragged himself to the top of the stairs. Then, he threw himself down head first. When he hit the bottom of the stairs, he actually passed out from the pain and from the exhaustion. At that point, Ted didn't have anything to eat or to drink at all since he was taken by Joe, and this made his injuries even worse, and he didn't even have strength. Ted was actually worried that Joe would poison him. That's why he refused any kind of drink or food. A few minutes later, after passing out, Ted woke up and he tried crawling through the living room into the kitchen. Ted actually passed out several times, dragging himself across the floor. As Ted was in the living room trying to get to the kitchen, the front door opened. Joe walked in. He was in shock, Joe. He couldn't believe that this 90-pound boy got to where he was with all of the injuries that he had. He grabbed Ted and carried him back up to the bed. As punishment for trying to escape, Ted suffered even more injuries. Joe started twisting Ted's ankles even more and repeatedly jumped on his chest and hit him. His leg got stretched back until his thigh bone fractured. Joe just took all of his anger out on Ted. Ted had no idea why, but he could feel every single part of it. After the beating and the torture, Joe carried Ted back down to the couch, and again they watched a few movies as if nothing happened. In the end, Ted dozed off and he slept for a few hours. The next morning, Ted woke up and he looked at his legs. They didn't even look like they were human legs. They were completely bruised and started to turn yellow and swollen all over. And the pain was just excruciating. Once Joe saw that Ted had woken up, he carried Ted up to the bed again and started torturing him again. Every few hours he came back to torture him even more. At one point, he grabbed Ted's left leg and he started twisting at the knee. Because of this, the knee snapped and was facing backwards. Backwards. Can you guys just imagine? Backwards. Ted couldn't do anything to stop this. He even said to himself that there was no way he was walking out of the house. The second time that he tried to escape, Ted managed to crawl down the stairs and into the kitchen before Joe returned home with his girlfriend. They were watching TV in the living room as Ted hid in the kitchen, but as soon as Joe's girlfriend left, he again found Ted. After his second attempt at escaping failed, Ted would be locked in a closet whenever Joe left the house. In between the attacks on Ted, Joe actually pretended that they were friends. When he took breaks from torturing Ted, Joe would just carry him to the couch so that they could watch movies together, and he would have conversations with Ted as if, nothing happened. Joe would talk about his family, about his car, how he lived with his brother in his dirty house, and his girlfriend who was in the house at the same time that Ted was being held captive. But the most shocking revelation came when Joe told Ted that he had already murdered 2 other boys. And this actually gave Ted a bigger motivation to try and escape, because he knew what would happen if he didn't, and he wanted people to know that Joe killed 2 boys. Apart from pretending to be Ted's friend, Joe would also switch between torturing Ted and giving him care, looking after his injuries. After Joe would finish a session of breaking Ted's bones, he would take white socks and rub them over Ted's broken legs until they became padded. Joe also forced Ted to wear leg braces and try to walk around before starting another series of torture. Ted later said that Joe would stomp on his broken bones after tending to his wounds. A few hours later, as the sun set once again, Joe was planning on going to a party. By this point, Ted made 3 different attempts to escape, but he was caught each time, resulting in more severe beatings. This time, however, Joe decided that he didn't want to take any chances, and so he carried Ted over to the closet in the bedroom. He threw him in and he then locked the door. So now is July 31st, and as Ted laid there in the closet, he heard the front door close and a car driving away. Ted knew that he had to get out of that house. He could feel that his body was slowly starting to give up. This day was one of his younger brother's birthdays, and all he wanted to do was to be home with his family. So in this closet, Ted was looking for something to escape with, a tool or, something which could help him. Luckily, Ted found an electric guitar, so he grabbed it and he started beating at the door with it, praying that it would break something which would allow him to get out of that closet. After repeatedly beating on this door, the door finally gave way and Ted was able to unlock the handle and just get out of there. Again, he crawled from the bedroom closet, across the room and into the hall to the top of the stairs. He threw himself down head first, and then he passed out at the bottom of the stairs. He was completely exhausted. He passed out multiple times because of his weakness and the excruciating pain that he was in. But Ted was just determined to escape. Using everything he had, he dragged himself through the living room and into the kitchen, passing out a few more times in the process. Once he got to the kitchen, he saw a phone on the wall which he knew worked because earlier in the night he heard Joe talking to his girlfriend about going to the party. He needed to reach this phone so that he could call for help. It was almost pitch dark in the kitchen, but this didn't stop Ted. He couldn't actually get up on his feet because of his obvious injuries, and the only reason that Ted was able to call 911 was because the phone in the kitchen, which was on the wall, had a long cord which he was able to reach, so he pulled the cord with the receiver. Ted was actually quite lucky that the phone's keypad was on the receiver and it wasn't on the wall. When he called 911, he told the operator that he was kidnapped and that his legs were broken and so on. So basically he told the operator everything that happened to him. Now, there are some articles and there are some sources which say that the police initially believed this was a prank, but Ted would later say that he told the operator who he was and that he was being held captive. He remembered enough from walking to the house that he could give them a general idea of his location, and he was also able to give them Joe's name. Ted then said that the police knew where he was straight away, and they also knew who Joe was because they dealt with him in the past. So police went to Joe's house and they actually managed to find Ted. He was disoriented, suffering from severe dehydration, with broken legs, broken ankles, broken bones, and even more injuries. The first responders, they rushed Ted to St. Clair's Hospital and he was immediately taken in for surgery for his broken legs. The doctor said that they tried desperately to save his legs. His legs were so badly damaged and shattered in so many places that they had no idea they would be able to save them. Meanwhile, Baraboo police waited for Joe to return home. And he did. So police arrested Joe, they took him into custody, and from there they started searching his house. They looked for any indication of previous victims, but instead they found evidence to suggest that Joe intended to capture and torture even more boys. The sheriff deputies transported Joe Clark to a juvenile detention center and they sat down for an interview with him. But at no time during the arrest interviews did Joe Clark become forthcoming or honest with anybody. Initially, Joe was held on kidnapping charges, which gave detectives a bit more time to investigate other potential charges. According to Joe, on previous occasions, he did look through Ted's yard before going to the house after midnight on the 29th of July. After seeing that the Phillips car wasn't at the house, assuming that the parents were not home, that's when he decided to go in. So Joe was actually stalking the family. Joe said that when he showed up at the house at midnight, the door was unlocked, so of course, Joe took this as an open invitation and he just went in the house. That's how he found Ted sleeping on the couch with his 5-year-old sister. And we know the rest. According to Joe, he assisted Ted off the couch, but he essentially kidnapped Ted. But beyond that, Joe said that he conveniently blacked out. He just doesn't remember anything. He didn't remember anything of what happened over those 2 days. Yeah, like I said, very convenient. And perhaps a plan for a future plea in his trial. Back at the hospital, the Phillips family were relieved that Ted had been found and they went to the hospital to check on him. They were shocked to discover that doctors were trying to put rods, pins, and stabilizers in Ted's legs. The parents had absolutely no idea what Ted just went through. The doctors were now thinking that they might need to amputate Ted's legs, and they just had no hope of saving them. This would have been devastating for Ted because he just loved sports. He was an active teenager. In the meantime, Ted's father, Donald, talked to the police. He told police that he never heard of Joe Clark. As far as he was aware, Ted wasn't even friends with him, so this must have been just a random attack. For some reason, Joe must have just snapped, but Donald had no idea that Ted wasn't Joe's only victim. Back at Joe's house, police found a school notebook which listed names of over a dozen local boys, including some boys that Ted knew. The boys' names were in different columns, detailing whether or not Joe could kidnap them soon or maybe later and what he wanted to do to them. Part of this list included a column titled The Leg Thing, suggesting that he intended to break the bones of his future victims as well.
Really new to me because because my mom and dad carried me to bed when I'd fall asleep. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why. You know, I was looking around. He was being the nicest guy in the world. Ran as fast as I could down the stairs. Can't run very fast with a broken ankle.
More, so he gathered a bunch of elastic bandages he had laying around and then pulled out a drawer filled to the brim with brand new white socks.
Those ace bandages around my legs, and he had these leg braces from hospital or something. I don't know. He's putting those on me, and he had socks, and he put layers and layers of socks on my feet, and I had just perfect every single sock.
Ted Phillips would later testify that Joe Clark had told him about murdering a boy called Chris just the year before. Police were then able to link his testimony to the murder of 14-year-old Christian Steiner, who had gone missing from his home on July the 4th, 1994. Christian A. Chris Steiner was born on 19th of November 1979. On the morning of July the 4th, 1994, he had a shift at his new job, and when his parents went to wake him up at 6:15 a.m., he was nowhere to be found. Chris's father, George, told police that he checked on Chris that night at 10 p.m. and he was fast asleep in his bed. This would be the last time that anyone would see Chris alive. An investigation of the house found that the screen to a ground floor bedroom window was slashed. This was actually Chris's older brother's room. His brother was staying out for the night. Muddy footprints were also found throughout the inside of the house, and the ground floor patio doors were unlocked. George and Catherine, Chris's parents, along with the police, initially agreed that this was simply just a case of a teenage boy sneaking out to a party or sneaking out to see a girl. This was the 4th of July weekend, so it wasn't that unusual, although it was very unusual for Chris to run away. As the hours turned into days and Chris didn't make it back home, the sneaking out didn't really make sense anymore. Police then came up with another theory that Chris had run away. But his parents didn't agree with this theory at all. They knew their son and he was really excited about his new job and everything was fine at home, so he had absolutely no reason to run away. On the 10th of July, with no updates in the investigation, a body was found in the Wisconsin River, and the dental records would confirm that it was sadly the body of Chris Steiner. At this point, the body was badly decomposed and bloated from being days in the water, and police had no idea how Chris ended up in the river. The cause of his death was listed as drowning and the manner as undetermined. And this is how it would stay until 1 year later, when Ted Phillips became an example of strength and determination. After Ted's testimony about what Joe had told him, investigators were eager to find out more. So, Christian's body was exhumed and the second autopsy was performed. This time, they did an X-ray, and after an X-ray, the coroner reported that Chris suffered broken knees and broken ankles, very similar to the injuries that Ted had. The findings of the second autopsy and their implications came as no surprise to Kathy Steiner, Chris Steiner's mom. She always suspected Joe Clark. She had said that he was the last one to speak with Chris that night. Joe wanted him to go somewhere with him, but Chris refused. Joe also knew that Chris's brother was not going to be home that night, and that's why he broke through the brother's room. According to Kathy, Chris's mom, Joe would be hanging around her son a lot in the days before he disappeared. And Joe was just very domineering, and he would usually hang around younger boys because he could bully them. As the coroner's office conducted their second autopsy of Chris's body, investigators served a search warrant at the Clark home in Fairfield, Wisconsin. Among the evidence seized in the search was a 48 by 40-inch plywood board with satanic writing and illustrations scribbled on it, a film canister with possible marijuana seeds inside, a leg brace and a body brace, several horror films on VHS, and they also found several sketches of house interiors in the area. Joe was actually drawing people's houses, more specifically the interiors of people's houses, but how was he even able to do that? Would he sneak in to see the interior of people's houses? I mean, I have no idea, but it sounds like that. He would then maybe go back home and study the drawings, planning his route and stuff like that. Investigators also found the broken guitar that Ted said he used to break out of the house. And they also discovered 3 lists which were titled Get to Now, Can Wait, and Leg Thing. And each of these lists had several names of local boys in the area. And let's not forget that Joe is 17 years old at this point, so where are his parents? Where were his parents in those 2 days that he tortured Ted? You have this boy who is stalking neighbors, drawing sketches of interiors of homes, writing lists of boys in the area, creeping on boys in the area, and you, as the parent, you have no idea? So, according to Ron Clark, Joe's father, Joe was actually in a motorcycle accident in May of 1993, the year earlier, in which he was thrown 30 to 40 feet through the air and he landed on his head, potentially causing some brain trauma. His father said that maybe Joe just snapped. Apparently, after his accident, he started having quite a temper. The following year, Chris was found dead. Apparently, kids at school immediately and regularly taunted Joe about Chris's death, saying that he did it. And, they were right. The kids at school, they just knew it. They probably got a taste of the real Joe to make them think that he killed Chris. With Joe Clark being 17 years old, his crimes being so brutal that he shocked seasoned investigators, and with his history of getting in trouble, there were conversations if the juvenile justice system was even equipped to handle a case like this, because it was going to attract a lot of public attention and interest. But after 2 days of debate and consideration, Judge Virginia Woolf ruled that Joseph Clark would be tried as an adult. So on September the 7th, 1995, Joe appeared before a judge in the circuit court where he was charged with attempted first-degree intentional homicide, burglary, kidnapping, intentionally causing great bodily harm to a child, mayhem, causing mental harm to a child, and 2 counts of child enticement. If convicted on all counts, he was going to get around 170 years in prison. Because Joe Clark was tried in an adult court, this meant that his name could be released to the public. This made people very interested in this case. What could motivate a 17-year-old to commit such brutal acts? And then Joe Clark went to trial. During her testimony, Joe's mother, Bertha Clark, told the jury that Joe was genuinely distraught over Chris Snyder's death and it caused a noticeable change in him. Basically, his parents didn't really believe that he was the one who killed Chris. According to Joe's parents, the harassment at school became so bad that they actually had to withdraw Joe from Baraboo High School before he was even able to finish his senior year. And when they pulled him out of school, he worked a few entry-level farm jobs. And he also worked at a local restaurant as a dishwasher for a while, as a cook as well. So, his parents were kind of trying to find excuses for him. But Joe had a violent, antisocial behavior. It's just unbelievable that everything happened in their home and they didn't know. I mean, how is that even possible? It seems that on the evening of Ted's abduction, Joe's parents were visiting their daughter in Portage and they weren't planning to return until the following day. So they left Joe alone in the house for most of the weekend. Joe's father even defended their choices to reporters, saying that Joe was 17 and it wasn't illegal to be left alone, Plus, they also checked on him. They called Friday night, so it wasn't like they were out of touch with him. But according to investigators who conducted the initial search of the Clark home, the house was in a state of big disarray when they arrived. The kitchen was just full of beer bottles, and when they looked in Joe's personal journal, which was taken into evidence, he detailed his parents' extreme alcoholism. At one point in his diary, he said that his mom and dad were downstairs getting drunk again. So, if that's the case, and Joe's parents were abusing alcohol, that would explain the state of the house and also the fact that they were not aware of the weird and also scary things that Joe was doing. According to Joe, his mother drank routinely and intensely to the point of passing out all the time. But his mom said that's just not true. She never drank to the point of passing out. But then on the other hand, we also know that people who abuse alcohol, they will never admit that they have a problem. The press and the public at this point are speculating on Joe's possible motive and the circumstances which led him to become a monster. At first, Joe's trial for the crimes against Ted Phillips was supposed to be in early September, presented in two parts. The first part was to determine if he committed these crimes, and the second was to see if he did this because of mental defect or disease, so basically insanity. But when he appeared before a circuit court judge on September the 5th, 1996, Joe pleaded no contest to the charges against him. So they didn't really need to do the first part to prove his innocence or guilt. Pleading guilty means that you admit you committed the crime, whereas pleading no contest means that you accept the conviction but avoid an admission of guilt. So basically you're not saying you're innocent, but you're not saying you're guilty. So now they had to determine if Joe was mentally incapacitated when he abducted, tortured, and attempted to kill Ted Phillips. The trial to determine his competency began on September 16, 1996. During this time, his defense attorney, Mark Frank, presented a case for insanity. The defense's case rested largely on the head trauma and the potential brain injury suffered when Joe was thrown from the motorcycle. According to medical records, Joe suffered a blood clot above the covering of the brain. He made a quick recovery after the surgery, but since the accident, Mark Frank, Joe's lawyer, told the jury that Joe had and continues to have an abnormal condition of the mind. According to the defense attorney, the injuries that Joe had from the accident required treatments, including having arteries to the brain cauterized, which could affect mental processes. He called several witnesses who also gave testimony saying that there were dramatic changes in his behavior, and in the years after the accident, he had hallucinations, psychotic behavior, suicidal impulses, delusions, social impairment, and personality. But these were just witnesses. They were not expert witnesses, as in professionals you would get. Under cross-examination, however, several of these witnesses were not so effective for the defense. Joe's mother, Bertha, for example, made Joe's injuries seem worse and worse. When prosecutor Pat Barrett cross-examined her, basically said that her 8th grade education couldn't be expected to understand medical terminology. Although she wasn't doing so well when it came to describing the physical trauma that her son suffered in the accident, she did insist that she saw a big change in Joe after the accident, which could very well be true. She said that something was terribly wrong and he needs psychiatric treatment. But the thing is that if she knew that, why didn't she try to help him, get him some mental health treatment, something, I don't know. The prosecution produced a large amount of reports from various school and social service agencies who had all done assessments of Joe in the years before. He had punched another student and he also threatened to kill a teacher. So, there were warning signs there. And the reports contradicted the claim that Joe needed considerable care after the accident because he showed violence even before his accident. He was evaluated for psychological impairments after that as well, and there was just nothing. They could find nothing psychologically wrong with him. So I guess that the insanity defense just went out the window. The prosecution also pointed out that Bertha Clark may see a need for psychological treatment now, but his parents at no time tried to get him help before this happened. Before she was on the stand screaming at everyone that Joe needs help, none of them did anything to try and get him some help. Joe's case was put together by the defense, relying almost exclusively on the testimony of regular witnesses and no experts. There were no experts to speak on the physical, mental, or emotional health of Joe before or after the head injury. Four psychologists evaluated Joe Clark after he was arrested, and none of them were willing to support a diminished capacity defense. The prosecution's first witness was Ted Phillips. He detailed the absolutely horrific ordeal for the court. He said Joe grabbed his throat and twisted his right ankle. He could feel the ankle snap. He also said, quote, "When I looked down, my foot was on backwards. He pushed my leg up at an angle towards my head. He kept pushing it until it broke." End of quote. Joe also told the jury that early on, after he was kidnapped, he asked Joe if he had ever done this before, and Joe responded saying, "Do you know Chris Steiner?" According to Ted, Joe Clark also told him that there was an unnamed boy that he paralyzed. Another boy who was with Joe in juvenile detention also testified that Joe bragged about murdering a boy and hanging the body over a tree. However, police were never able to link Joe Clark to a second murder. Among the last witnesses to be called by the prosecution was the well-known forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz. He had actually testified in the Jeffrey Dahmer case, the Ted Kaczynski case, and Betty Broderick. According to Park, Joe Clark, quote, "is a serial sexual sadist who takes pleasure in breaking his victims' legs," end of quote. But his antisocial personality disorder is not a legal defense to his crimes. Park also said that Joe is faking his amnesia and falsely claiming every kind of hallucination known to man in order to avoid responsibility for his crimes. As evidence of defiant pathology, Park said that Joe wrapped Ted's legs in bandages and put 3 pairs of white gym socks on his feet before masturbating in front of him. According to Park, Joe has a fetish for gym socks, which he took from the Phillips home before kidnapping Ted. The fact that he masturbated in front of the injured victim showed that he was aroused by making people suffer. The following day, September 18th, the jury deliberated for just 1 hour before unanimously rejecting the defense's claim that Joe Clark was suffering from any kind of mental incapacity when he kidnapped and tortured Ted Phillips. Moments after the verdict was read, Ted was smiling and he was hugging Pat Barrett, the prosecution attorney, and he was very happy with the outcome of the trial, as he told reporters at the sentencing hearing. On November 14th, Joe Clark was sentenced to 100 years in prison for the kidnapping and assaults of Ted. In October 1997, a civil court judge ruled in favor of Ted Phillips and ordered Joe Clark to pay $31,566 in medical damages, $6 million in compensatory damages, and $21 million in damages to the victim. But Joe Clark had no money at the time. So the judge ruled that she was going to allow him to make money from the case so that he could pay the money back. She said, given the sensational nature of this case, it's entirely possible that the defendant could reap some financial gain through media coverage in the future, and any earnings would go to Ted, which is really weird. Really weird. Now, moving on to the murder trial of Christian Steiner, Joe Clark had been among the small number of potential suspects that had been interviewed following the discovery of Chris's body. Chris's parents strongly suspected him being involved in their son's death from the very beginning. Investigators' suspicions only grew following Joe's arrest the previous year. A second autopsy of Chris Steiner's body had shown injuries that were so similar to Ted's injuries. And then Ted's testimony that Joe had just admitted to him that he did it. Less than a week after the verdict was read in the case against Joe Clark for the attack on Ted Phillips, Mark Bennett announced that he will be filing criminal charges against Joe Clark for the murder of Christian Steiner. Mark Bennett was either the judge or a lawyer, I'm not really clear on this. In a press conference a day later, he mentioned the testimony collected during the Ted Phillips investigation, but he said that they do have other evidence as well. After the press conference, Ron and Bertha Clark, Joe's parents, they spoke out against the Columbia County District Attorney's Office. They accused investigators of misrepresenting the facts of the case, and they said, quote, "We are talking about two kids who got in a fight. The police made up the rest of the story," end of quote. Even after Joe's conviction, his parents still believed their son was being unfairly accused of murder, and they said that he's only accused because he was seen with Chris the day he disappeared. The preliminary hearing was due in early October, and Ted Phillips was going to be the state's main witness in the case. Even though they had other evidence, his testimony was the key to prosecuting the case. But a few days before the hearing was supposed to start, Ted Phillips got into an argument with another boy, which resulted in the boy shooting Ted in the shoulder. According to the shooter, called Michael, Ted and a friend threatened to kill him, and they went into his home without permission, so he shot Ted in the back. Ted recovered by the following month. And in early November, Joe was formally charged with 3 criminal counts, including first-degree intentional homicide of Christian. The trial began on November the 4th, 1997, with Kathy and George Steiner being the first witnesses called. In their testimonies, both parents told the jury how they discovered their son was missing, the frantic search that followed, and then finding out that Chris's body was found in the river. Kathy Steiner told the jury about the argument her son had with Joe Clark that afternoon. The Steiner murder case unfolded the same as the Phillips case did, a lot of the same evidence and many of the same witnesses. This time, however, Ron and Bertha Clark tried to provide an alibi for Joe Clark. They told the jury that Joe was asleep in his bed on July the 3rd, 1994, the night that Chris Steiner was believed to have been abducted. But the prosecutor was having none of this. She confronted Bertha with the photos of empty beer cans in the house being in disarray, as well as Joe's journal where he repeatedly wrote about his parents drinking and how they were always passed out and they were always incapacitated. The prosecution said that this was indicative of a pattern, so they really can't trust this alibi. After several days of testimony, the jury sided with the prosecution and Joe was found guilty for the first-degree murder of Christian Steiner. 2 weeks later, he was brought before Judge James Evanson for sentencing. Judge Evanson called Joe Clark a mean, sadistic killer and noted that the evidence was overwhelming in proving his guilt despite his continued statements of innocence. Before passing his sentence, Judge Evanson asked whether Joe Clark had anything to say to the court, and Joe said, "I've done nothing wrong. You are condemning an innocent person." In the end, Joe Clark was sentenced to 110 years in prison for the murder of Chris Steiner, which he had to serve concurrently with his 100-year sentence for the abduction and torture of Ted Phillips. He will have to serve at least 70 years of his sentence before even being eligible for parole. Outside the courthouse, his parents said that the sentence was wrong and they called the trial a witch hunt. Apparently, they accused the authorities of conspiring against their son. They said it's only circumstantial evidence, testimony from some kids they dragged from jail to tell stories. In the fall of 1998, Joe Clark did appeal the ruling in the Ted Phillips case and challenged the factual basis for his convictions on the homicide of Chris Steiner, mayhem, and mental harm charges. The petition said that Joe was wrongfully convicted of mayhem. Now, if you don't know what mayhem is, honestly, I had no idea either. Mayhem is defined as an act committed by someone with intent to disable or disfigure another person, someone who cuts or mutilates the tongue, ear, eye, nose, lip, limb, or other bodily member of another. So, Joe's lawyer said that due to advances in science and medicine, Ted Phillips didn't suffer any permanent damage. So Joe cannot be guilty of mayhem as is defined by the law. I mean, as you can tell, probably at this point they were just grasping at straws, really. The court disagreed with that argument and they upheld the original finding. The judge said, quote, "We do not see anything in either the historical notion of mayhem or its current placement in the statutory scheme which would require victims' disablement or disfigurement to be permanent. It's reasonable to infer that Clark knew that these injuries would disable his victim from escaping, especially in light of Clark's additional threat to paralyze the victim if he tried to leave the house." End of quote. Additional challenges were made to the attempted murder and mental harm to a child charges. There was a second appeal which was filed in March 1999 and it argued that several pieces of evidence in the Steiner murder case, specifically Ted's testimony and the list of names discovered on those lists and the investigations, lacked merit, and the verdict should be reversed. The petition argued that because these pieces of evidence were from a separate trial from the Ted Phillips trial, they should not have been allowed to be used in another trial. After reviewing all of the evidence, the initial ruling was upheld. So I guess it's safe to say that Joe Clark is going to be in jail forever, for the rest of his life at least. To this day, Joe Clark maintains that he has no memory of what he did to Ted and claims that he is innocent of Christian's death. Surgeries and long-term medical care helped Ted Phillips to walk and use his legs again, although he still walks with a limp. When he went into the hospital, Ted had serious life-threatening internal bleeding, and doctors even said that if he wouldn't have called 911 when he did, he would only have 2 hours left to live. Ted received immediate medical care but to repair his legs, and in hopes of saving his mobility, he required a lot of surgeries over several years. In April 2023, Baraboo local Olga Johnson and her husband set up a GoFundMe with a $100,000 goal to help Ted Phillips. Olga said that Ted saved the community and he brought peace to Chris's family, so she just wanted to thank him. And I'm going to leave the GoFundMe page in the description down below. If you want to have a look at it or to donate, you are more than welcome to do that. And yes, this was a very, very long video and oh, I have lipstick on my teeth. And yeah, guys, just let me know what you guys think about this case in the comment section down below. For now, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!